slide is hiding under the hood to make sure everything runs. Today we get to speak with Jana Fischer, co-founder and CEO of Navignostics, a data-driven cancer diagnostics company. Welcome, Jana.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. This is my first podcast, actually.
Ooh, we're glad to have the honor of breaking you into the world of podcasting. So let's jump right into our very first question. So tell us, Jana, why does Navignostics exist?
Navignostics is a spin-off from the University of Zurich. So, we're four people that founded Navignostics together. So, my co-founders, Andreas, Stefan, Bernd, and I. And we all work together in academic research. And what we did there is we analyzed tumors with our very advanced imaging and computational approaches. And we always did that on retrospective cancer cohorts. And we could see that in these settings, we were always extremely good at distinguishing different patient groups. So that had different molecular properties that then also explained why these different patient groups responded differently to the treatments that they had received or why they had different survival outcomes. So that's really when we thought our approaches are so powerful, we should really be moving those into a clinical setting to actually benefit patients with our tools instead of just being able to say retrospectively, oh, we could have told you that you have a different molecular tumor property. And that's why we then, in the first step, got the chance, still as part of the academic lab, to take part in an observational clinical trial. And the aim of that trial was really to test novel tumor analysis approaches to see whether they are suitable for clinical application. So, from the logistical point of view, whether it's integratable in the clinical routine, but also whether the data that we deliver are actually useful to clinicians. And in this setting, we demonstrated that our data is extremely valuable to clinicians and they actually really appreciated it to support their treatment decisions, especially in difficult cases, especially in cases with respect to immunotherapy treatment decisions, where it's very important to know a lot about the tumor and the exact types of immune cells that are present. And this is really what prompted us then to start the company Navignostics to make this into a product and actually benefit patients much more broadly and eventually worldwide with our tumor analysis and treatment informing approach.
So you're talking about solutions for doctors essentially to help find the treatment to their patients, but you also mentioned, at least on your website, that your tool can be, or your product can be used for coming up with new treatments. So how does that work? How does it all come together?
Yes, exactly. So when you think about it, really drug developers and clinicians are having the same issue here. Both want to match the right patients with the right drugs. For clinicians, it's that they want to find the optimal one or the optimal combination of drugs that will best help each individual patient. And for drug developers, it's that they need to find the subgroup of patients that will best benefit from the novel drug that they're developing. Because unfortunately, at the moment, most clinical trials fail, often in very late stages of the development too, and that means drug development companies lose billions every year in such failed clinical trials. And these trials often fail only because there is no way to identify the subgroup of patients that will best benefit from the novel drug. And therefore, the drug can demonstrate a significant efficacy, so a significant benefit for a patient population, because patients were randomly involved into the clinical trial, and some of them may benefit, but because there was no way to just select those patients that benefit, overall, it's hard to demonstrate an actual clear benefit of the novel drug. So therefore, we work together with drug developers to help them very early on already in a drug development process characterize the tumors see exactly, for example, what is the effect on the tumor microenvironment when you treat a patient with a novel drug. And then later on, identify signatures that separate responders from non responders to this novel drug. And this then helps enroll the right patients into the clinical trial and therefore increases the success rate of the clinical trial. But later on, it also helps develop, for example, a companion diagnostic for this drug that then in clinical application directly identifies the patients that should receive this drug and therefore also increases the likelihood of a patient actually responding to this drug, which is, of course, a benefit not only for the patients and the clinicians and the drug developers, but also for the overall health system, because it means that you're saving costs on unnecessary treatments that are given to the wrong patients. And therefore, then also the health insurance are more inclined, of course, to pay for these drugs that come with a companion diagnostic.
This is fun. I'm making comparisons to the previous podcast episode where we interviewed a co-founder of an ag tech company where they provide solutions for farmers to measure the health of their soil and then determine which kind of fertilizers and how much they need to use that is customized for their fields. This sounds like essentially the same principle that you take an individual patient and you figure out exactly what combination of medication fits for them uniquely and nobody else as well.
That's a very nice parallel. Yeah. I mean, essentially, we just analyze in detail every individual tumor and we analyze all components of the tumor, probably like in your previous podcast was discussed.
Mhm.
So we analyze the individual cells in the tumor, so we can see what types of cells, what types of tumor cells are there, what targetable properties do they have, with what drugs can you best attack them, and we also see which immune cells are present in the tumor and where they are and how they're interacting with the tumor cells. And therefore, we can also make recommendations with respect to immunotherapy, because there is this extremely important to know, for example, whether the immune cells are actually detecting the tumor, whether they are able to infiltrate the tumor, whether they're already in direct contact with the tumor cells, and based on that, you can then, for example, decide that how a patient would optimally benefit from a immune checkpoint inhibitor, because the immune cells are in place. They are ready to attack the tumor cells. Essentially, we just need to inhibit this one thing that prevents them from attacking the tumor cells. So therefore, yeah, very similar situation. Just analyze all components that are there and make the best conclusion.
So that's a lot of cancer, small cancer diagnostics or cancer treatment companies around. And I mean, I've dabbled a bit in the medical field, not as a professional myself, but from communications perspective. But I don't have enough knowledge and understanding to tell the difference. So, how is your solution different from what else is going on, or do you see that there's a lot of competition doing similar things?
Yeah, we're actually bringing something very novel into clinics. So what we do is actually highly multiplex imaging. So we measure many, many different proteins at the same time in tissue sections. And this somewhat compares to what they do in routine clinical pathology. But there they measure individual proteins in tissue sections. They stain them with a dye that the pathologist then visually assesses and, for example, counts the number of cells that are positive for a given protein. But they are limited to doing that one protein at a time, one tissue section at a time. And that is far away from being able to test the total amount of features that could be attacked in a tumor by treatments. And therefore, our approach is a massive step forward, because instead of testing an individual protein, we measure 50 or even more proteins in a single tissue section at the same time. And because we can do that in one tissue section, we not only save tumor material that is sometimes very valuable when you only have biopsies of patients. But we also are able to then quantify all of these different proteins on the level of the individual cells. So we know exactly what types of cells that are present based on all of these complex proteins. And we aren't limited to going one marker by one marker. And of course, which also loses time, um, which you often don't have when a tumor is very aggressive. Um, so this is sort of the routine pathology, but another step forward, of course, a huge step forward was genomic analysis of tumors. They can simultaneously test hundreds of genomic markers, which is fantastic. But unfortunately, it is only an indirect indication of what's happening on the protein level. For example, for immunotherapy treatments, um, you can, for example, use the tumor mutational burden as an approximation of whether a patient might respond to immunotherapy. But that often has intermediate levels and it is not a very reliable predictor. And therefore, it is extremely valuable when you then, on top of this information, have the information that we can provide of what actual proteins are there on the tumor cells and on the immune cells, because these proteins are the actual targets of the cancer drugs.
So, to get an ideal result from diagnostics and therapeutics and so on, it's essentially a collaboration, and that you see yourselves as one part of a bigger whole, of a bigger community that tries to make patients' lives better.
Certainly, yeah. I think the data that we can provide is very complementary to genomic data, and there are situations, certain kind of treatments where genomic markers are highly predictive, and there's others where they just don't deliver exactly the type of information that is relevant to take the treatment decision. And in those cases, our data comes in incredibly valuable.
So how will that work in practice? Is there, like, do you have partnerships in mind already, or how easy is it? Because the little I know of the medical and therapeutic and diagnostic field is that it's highly regulated and there's like massive thresholds to get anywhere in that field. So how far are you? How close are you to this ideal image of you being a crucial part of the picture?
hmm Yeah, that's a very good point because there are several sort of barriers in this field, right? So the first one is the regulatory approval barrier. So we have to meet all the regulatory requirements to be able to provide our diagnostic service to clinicians to actually inform treatment decisions. And for this, we have already started heavily engaging into our developments, which will conclude for Switzerland in 2025. So in 2025, we'll reach approval to provide our diagnostic service on the Swiss market. Um, but that's not, of course, not the only barrier. On one hand, we want to expand beyond Switzerland. So our next target market will be the US market. And therefore, already now we're engaging with the FDA to make sure we are fully aware of what the FDA requirements are and that we, in parallel, fulfill both the Swiss and the European requirements as well as the FDA requirements so that we then don't lose any time due to some misunderstanding. So we're aiming to reach the US market shortly after the Swiss market, maybe with a gap of 1 year. And after the regulatory approval, the next question to really get established in the clinical routine is, of course, to get reimbursement by health insurances. This is also something that has to be developed country by country. It's also another reason why we're aiming for the US market as a second step after the Swiss market, because here in Europe, we have to develop a separate reimbursement strategy for each country.
Mm,
and whereas the US market is the biggest market that we can reach with just one reimbursement strategy.
mm-hmm,
Um, that is also a step that is where we're a little bit paving the way because we have a novel type of approach, and therefore we also have to explore what exactly has to be demonstrated to the health insurances, what they're willing to pay for this type of test. We can orient ourselves a little bit with the genomic tumor analysis test. So we sort of use that as a guideline and follow in a similar path. Um, but essentially, here in Switzerland, we'll have to get on what's called a TARMET list, and then we'll get default reimbursement for our test. Before that, reimbursement has to be requested on an individual case basis by the clinician, and the health insurance has to decide, which is, of course, not the ideal case because it adds extra work.
Mm.
mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. So there,
Oh,
these. Sorry, go ahead.
sorry. I just wanted to ask, how much does it feel like collaboration? Much does it feel like working together? How much does it feel like fighting against something to make something happen?
um, it certainly feels like there are a lot of, let's say, barriers that are not necessarily meant for our type of test,
Mm.
that were established based on different types of approaches that are not fully adapted to our type of test, that are also not fully adapted to novel computational approaches like AI predictions, for example, regulatory approval for continuously improving AI predictions is still, yeah, something that it's not fully developed for these types of things. At least the regulations weren't fully developed for these types of things. But I think in the sense of when we're talking to clinicians, it feels like a collaboration. So I think we have very good supportive clinical collaborators, and they really try to help us navigate this field and also try to find with us a sort of a first step, an approach where we can get into the system, essentially, where it's easier to get reimbursement, where the clinical need is high, and therefore we can enter easily. One of those things is obviously again immunotherapy, because immunotherapies are extremely expensive. They can cost 20,000 Swiss francs per month, and health insurances of health insurances pay for them, but only in about 20% of patients an immunotherapy is actually successful. So if you can go to health insurances and tell them, hey, is our test costs almost nothing compared to what an immunotherapy costs, and we can save you potentially a lot of money, then this might be a good entry point there. So it does also feel like as long as we make the good, best sort of arguments that we can make towards health insurances, I can see that work very collaboratively as well, same as with the clinicians.
Mm.
Um, yeah, yeah. I hope that's the way it'll be, anyways.
Yeah, the whole field sounds like something that requires a much longer attention span and a lot of patience and grit, I suppose, compared to, like, I don't know, developing a game or an app or something where you essentially have yourselves to compete with and I don't know, the market and not the regulators so much.
For sure, yeah, diagnostics is definitely a highly regulated space that therefore comes with a lot of market entry barriers and some risks associated with that. But I'm really convinced that with our tools we can actually work our way up into the standard treatment guidelines to eventually even provide decision support on first, second, third line therapies, as well as sort of end of standard care situations where the clinicians are out of options and therefore are very thankful for additional information.
So tell me about your team. So you had 4 co-founders. Nowadays, you also have some employees. So what kind of group do you have together? Who are
Yeah,
these people who have all this patience to work for this?
we're now a proud group of 8 people in the company. Um, we are composed of scientists, world leading scientists with expertise in our field. So we really have an amazing group. We're supported by excellent software and laboratory developers, and of course then also business developers. So we, the founders, we're all scientists, but of course the business expertise is highly relevant in this field as well. So we have hired that into the team, and these are the people we have currently as part of the internal team. And then we also have a lot of very valuable advisors. So for regulatory, for legal, for IP, for accounting, all that we currently have externally, because we're not a big enough company yet to have internal capacities for this. And also very important, clinical expertise is something we're actually looking to bring in-house, if I can use this as a little bit of an advertisement platform.
All right. So clinical experts do apply for this rising startup.
Exactly. So we have excellent clinical advisors from the University Hospital of Zurich, oncology and pathology department actually. So this is incredibly valuable, but we are also looking to bring at least a part-time position in-house, a clinician that has experience sitting in tumor boards and making these difficult decisions, who understands the workflows of hospitals, also the financial systems of hospitals potentially, and has an interest in working together with us on our business development, marketing, product development aspects to make sure we're developing the optimal product for clinicians that they can also then really, really use and directly interpret, and to make sure we're integrating in the workflow in the most comfortable way for them. And of course, then to communicate to them what we're actually providing and to convince them of our test. So it would be great if we found such a clinical expert that has some interest in working with us.
All right. We'll have to mention this open job in the show notes and when we advertise this on social media.
Thank you very much.
I'm curious about you personally. So, how did you end up studying what you studied and then starting this company? So, what drew you into cancer research?
Yeah, so I originally I studied biology, but then took a turn into bioinformatics and computational biology. So for me, it was always the data analysis part that fascinated and excited me to, see the result of a project, of a experiment, of an analysis. So that I was always doing the computational end. I was never really a laboratory scientist. um, and after my master's, I already joined the Bodenmiller lab. So I was doing a project in the Bodenmiller lab, which is then also where I did my PhD and a short postdoc. And out of this lab, we then founded Navignostics. And I, to be honest, I had never much planned to start a company. As a kid, I certainly never had that as my dream job.
Mm-hmm.
um, but I also had never shown any interest in computers, so I guess I have taken quite a few turns in my career development. Yeah, first one was towards data analysis, computational, which then I loved, and the next one was away from academic research into starting a company, the startup environment, which I absolutely love now as well. And I think these sort of career turns have always been a great enrichment because you just really learn a lot by doing in a really short time. So I've
Hmm.
really enjoyed this whole company build up phase because even though the individual tasks you sometimes have to deal with may not be the most exciting, but in the end, everything is rewarding because you get a deeper understanding of what it actually takes to build up a company and to keep it running. So I really
So,
enjoy that.
what were some biggest challenges you faced building up a company? But I'm certain it didn't go smooth.
I would say actually we had a pretty smooth experience, but
Ooh,
of
wow.
course, of course there were challenges. Well, looking back, there are never challenges, right? The challenges are all looking forward. Um, no, it certainly is a challenge to raise the first money as a company. So we had planned starting this company already while we were still working in academic research, and at this point we had started carefully talking to first investors to see whether this had a chance. And at the time we definitely weren't properly prepared, I would say. We had to first learn how to properly pitch, how to write a full business plan, get everything in place to really be ready to go out broadly and talk to lots of investors. And at the point where we really had the feeling we were ready for that, that is when we incorporated the company, and that was beginning of 2022. And then we went out broadly and approached so many investors. The typical situation, you always approach a lot of them. Cold emails usually never give you a response.
Hmm.
But we were lucky to be connected to quite a few of them through people we knew or through people they knew. And so eventually we got into more serious conversations with several different investors, which then really solidified once we found our lead investor. So, this is always a tricky thing. You have to find an investor that is willing to do the lead, to do all the work of the due diligence. And that in our case is Brucker. And they have from the moment they have decided to take the lead, everything sort of went very quickly, I would say. And our round was then even oversubscribed. So we expanded around a little bit to accommodate another investor that we also really wanted to have in the round based on their expertise. Um, Even though we had already reached the amount of money that we had originally planned to raise. Um, and so at this point, we're extremely happy with our combination of investors. They are all very supportive. They're also very supportive of having us founders in the lead. They're fully aligned with our vision and also supporting us with important connections to, for example, the the partner companies that we're now interacting with, that we're starting projects with, which is of course sometimes a tricky thing to reach the right people. And we were very lucky to, yeah, to have our investors and their associates connect us to the important people in the field on the clinical and the drug development side. So I would say, looking back, it went very smoothly, but of course, at the time, it was of course scary and exciting. I mean,
Hmm.
you talk to many different investors at the same time. You hear for several of them that they are interested in investing, but they won't take the lead, then you're sort of scrambling to find a lead because you want to secure them as investors. But of
Hmm.
course, the lead is always hardest to find. So, yeah, looking back, it all fell into place. So that's very nice. But it's an exciting time for sure.
Well, congratulations on such smooth sailing.
Thank you. I hope it continues.
Indeed, indeed. I'm curious. I don't know. Maybe this is a non sequitur, but maybe I'm jumping back in time because your background is a bit more in data science, and you also briefly mentioned the use of AI in your products. I mean, I think at this point AI is still a hot topic, and everybody's eyes always perk up when they hear it. And same for me. I want to ask more about it. Eventually, I presume we will stop getting excited about it because everybody just uses it. It's natural. It seems like I don't know, 75% of fresh companies we hear about somehow use AI. But while it's still a hot topic, tell me, what's the use of AI in Navignostic solutions?
Happily. And by the way, I'm also waiting for the moment when AI loses the buzz, but
Hmm.
clearly it hasn't yet. Yeah, so actually a very important vision of our company that I haven't mentioned yet is that while we are analyzing all these tumors, we store the data of all these analyzed tumors. And we also store the information how the patient responded to the treatment that they received. And this allows us to build up a very valuable, of course, database on which we can continuously learn. So we can use then this database to identify novel biomarkers, novel signatures. We can use that to help our drug development collaborators. But we can, of course, also use this to improve our own diagnostic product. And there, the aim is really that eventually we provide fully automated treatment predictions based on our AI models that can directly identify the optimal drug or drug combination for a patient based on how their tumor compares to a patient's tumor we previously analyzed and based on the successful treatment of this patient. So we basically, based on hundreds of thousands of tumor and associated treatment response data that we will have, we'll be able to continuously improve our models and make fully automated treatment predictions. And this is, of course, the big long-term vision of Navignostics. But it's really also where we see ourselves moving operationally. So over the years, we're planning to move more from a centralized lab service that we're providing at the moment towards probably a kit-based solution so that the measurements can be done locally in clinics. But we will continue to focus on our data analysis and our standardized report. So even when the kits, the measurements are performed locally in hospitals, we will continue to provide our data processing and analysis pipeline that will continue to provide the same standardized report that clinicians will then know and be used to. And we will store this way all of the data that is acquired and will continue to fuel this digital tumor and improve the treatment recommendations.
So does this mean some sort of a cloud service in the future? Yeah.
Exactly. Pretty much you do the measurement, upload the data, the raw data to our platform, and you get back a report with a treatment recommendation. Um, Eventually, a fully AI-based treatment recommendation, which will of course require some regulatory shifts in the meantime.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So the standard question regarding AI and people's fears towards it and our bad experiences with AI. How do you deal with the fact that the current AI models that the general population uses is very good at hallucinating. So how will your model actually provide correct predictions and recommendations instead of confidently come up with something that's nonsense?
Yeah, well, when you talk about something like ChatGPT, this is a language model, right? So what it's been trained to do is sound convincing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you use it, I also noticed that it also always it's very trained to give sort of politically correct answers and sort of very yeah, it does sound a little bit like a politician sometimes. It always has a disclaimer in the beginning, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So it's been trained to sound convincing, but not trained to give true answers. That's not
Mm-hmm.
its purpose. Um, and in our case, we'll obviously train our models to predict a a positive treatment response. So there will be nothing in our models that would favor the algorithm in just providing any output because we have zero benefit from that. But we really train the algorithm to just optimally predict the best treatment for the patient. And to do that, we'll feed it all this information that we can get of the tumor because that is how these algorithms will be most powerful because we can extract so much data from this tumor. So these are so many different dimensions of what the algorithm can learn from, and this is how we can optimally utilize these AI approaches because this data is so complex that the AI can see the patterns in it and pick the right aspects of the data that are optimally predictive to find exactly the right treatment for each patient.
Mm-hmm.
Then,
You
of
have to
course,
have like historical data of what actually worked and what didn't, so that the algorithm will recognize what works.
absolutely, exactly. And this is exactly the database of what we call our digital tumor that we are building up right now. So we are heavily engaged in collaboration projects already now with several different clinics here in Europe. Um, and we're measuring retrospective patient cohort samples because one very convenient aspect of our approach is that we can measure stored tumor probes. So these are fixed tumor probes from, for example, biobanks or that the hospitals have stored. And we can measure these dating years back. So these are probes to which we know how the patient responded to treatment. We even know how long the patient survived or how long the patient survived without progressing disease. So this is pretty much the optimal data that we can feed our algorithms because we already know everything that happened afterwards to the patient. Of course, we will also then continue to feed this these algorithms with novel data that we acquire. But then, of course, we have to make sure that we also get the information, the follow-up information. So how
Mm-hmm.
the patient then responded to the treatment. This is in a clinical trial setting quite feasible because in clinical trials, at least to a certain extent, treatment response is certainly followed up on. But in a routine clinical setting, this is actually going to be a little bit more of a challenge because clinicians will then have to provide this follow up data. And this will, of course, compete with their time to do other things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we'll have to come up with a way of doing this, providing this data for them extremely easily, and
Mm-hmm.
also potentially somehow incentivize them to provide this follow-up data with discounts or something. Um, Alternatively, we could, and there are a few apps now going in this direction, try to get the data from the patients directly, which has its separate challenges because then you don't necessarily know that you're getting this data in the standardized way. But it has been shown with a few sort of approaches where patients are connected via apps and to also exchange information, that there is quite a lot of interest of patients to provide voluntarily this type of information to potentially help other patients. So that could be an angle.
Yeah, yeah, I can actually recognize that. I've been part of a couple of studies. I think whenever somebody gives me a piece of paper, would you like to be in this study and feel this? I'm, oh, yes, I'm very excited. I once stopped doing a study because they sent me like this 30 pages of A4s that I needed to fill out. And I was like, okay, that's too much. But if it was a nice app that I could click a few times, then I would absolutely do it every single time.
Yeah, right. So this is exactly the type of thing we have to figure out optimally, right? We cannot show up with 30 pages that
Hmm.
patients have to sign. It has to be easy, both for clinicians or for patients. And yeah, we have to sort of reduce the barriers to participate as much as possible.
Yeah.
But like you said, in the meantime, our most valuable data source is retrospective data, where all the data is already available.
Yeah, that I'm actually curious about. Like is that like open source? Anyone can access it, or do you have to have the right relationships, or how hard is it to get that kind of data?
It's quite a challenge, and I think we're very lucky that we have very good clinical collaborations that can provide us with access to samples and clinical data. If we didn't have that, it can be very tricky to get access. From clinics, from pathologies, you can get access to these types of samples, but of course, they don't just give them to anyone. I mean, this is also
Hmm.
tumor material. It contains information. It's valuable. You have to make sure it's used in a proper way. You have to define a project, the name of the project, of course. Alternatively, you can actually buy tumor samples from biobanks, but they, especially if they're associated with follow-up data, can be very, very expensive.
Hmm.
So we're our primary aim is definitely to leverage our clinical collaborations and to do as many clinical partnership projects as possible, um, because there we can often also provide a benefit to the clinicians that are providing us with the samples. And we're discussing on an individual case basis what their interest is. Often they have maybe a research question in mind that they would like to have answered. For example, to publish, then we can do a project together and publish in the end our results on the retrospective cohort that we analyzed. And in return, we, of course, in a clinical setting, we pay for the analysis as a company, and we get to store then the data. That is, for example, one possible setup.
There's a lot of quid pro quo happening with data that yeah, it's all distributed. People have different players have different kinds of data, and you have to go scraping around. I wonder if there's any vision that sometime in the future there would be a centralized location for this kind of data that anyone would be. I don't know if that's like massively socialistic and utopistic of me, but what's the movement like? Is it more going towards people guarding their own data, people realizing that their data is valuable and selling, or is there any kind of movement in the cancer diagnostic in trying to provide something more open and more central?
I'm afraid the reason it's already kind of tricky to get to samples is that people have already realized that data is valuable.
Mm.
So they are guarding this already quite a bit, and I have a feeling it'll go further into that direction. Um, but in an academic setting, I think there are quite a few sort of collaboration projects that aim at, yeah, sharing data, collecting data, different types of data, integrating also different modes of data. So I think in an academic setting, there are several different project-based approaches to have to share data, to have open source projects. But then typically that type of data is then also not meant to be used for any commercial purposes, so
Mm-hmm.
then not accessible to us.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's a little in between. I would say on the company side, people definitely realize that data is valuable, and also when we're collaborating with drug developers, so in pharma companies, that'll be potentially a very hard negotiation to
Mm-hmm.
even get to store the data. That yeah, we have yet to see how some of these bigger negotiations will go. But in the end, we're not necessarily negotiating over data ownership. We
Mm.
just need to store a copy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I'm actually ready to jump into my last question, but I want to give Ave a chance to ask if there's anything you would want to bring up still.
Thank you. I I have two things. One is just a note that I found it very interesting to hear about the dichotomy that we have created between us as humans, as us as a society, demanding innovation from healthcare, from we want better patient care, better drugs, more accurate diagnostics. And then we've also made it, which I partly understand, it has to be very difficult and regulated to come to the market, but we've really made it very difficult. So that was an interesting thing to hear about. And the second question is a question. And you said that as a child, you never dreamed of having a company, running a company, being a leader of a company. What did you dream of becoming?
Good question. What did I dream of becoming? I think I was very sort of I grew up in a family of teachers. So I was very familiar with these sort of teaching jobs, but I think I became a little bit rebellious already quite young, and that I decided that didn't want to be a teacher, anything but that. And so I did have already quite early an interest in sort of biomedicine. And cancer has always fascinated me as a research topic. So a little bit of prognostic value there from my childhood.
Nice.
Okay. Interesting. Anything else from Ave? All good, all good. I mean, I think we could continue this conversation for ages. I didn't even realize I'm so
True.
interested in data, but I really am. Well, I'll have to learn more from you later on. But yeah, we are running out of time, and so I move to my last question. This is about future makers, so let's quickly take our eyes into the future. Tell me, Jana, what will the world look like 10 years from now?
I think I could make statements here that just age very poorly. No, I think that it will move into even more data driven in every regard, because I think people have already realized how valuable data is and how valuable predictions, data driven predictions, can be to several different parts of society, and especially also in healthcare. And I think that's very much where the healthcare field will move, in learning from real world data, making predictions based on data that has been acquired exactly along the axis that we're also aiming to go. I expect that we will not be the only data driven company that is making predictions for disease relevant matters based on molecular data that has been acquired 10 years from now. So I think that'll be very much the center of attention of the healthcare field.
All right. Thanks a lot. Spoken like a true data scientist, indeed.
Yeah, maybe I'm biased, you're right.
Well, good. Then This was Jana Fischer from Navignostics, and thank you, Jana. It was a pleasure having you here.
Thank you so much. It was a very nice experience having my first podcast with you.
Very good. And to our listeners, if you like hearing stories from people who make the world a better place through science and technology, you're in luck because there's more. So make sure to subscribe to the Future Makers podcast, for example, on Spotify. Until next time.